Hello, dear ones. It is so good to be with you again. Yesterday we had our annual tolling of bells service, and as always happens with me, I'm amazed at the amount of loss that is occurring in any gathered religious community. And as the names rolled in over the past week and a half, we've sat with how much loss we are all carrying and how much you are carrying. And it got me to thinking about the American way of grief and how it has changed so dramatically over time. Now, in the Victorian era, we viewed that era often through the historical lens and actually called them grief obsessed or mourning obsessed, because when they lost a person, they would change their wardrobe, they would dress in black, they would frequently put a black wreath on their door or put a black ribbon on their mailbox so that everyone in the neighborhood, whether they knew the person or not, knew that this was a household consumed in grief. Another interesting shift to take note of is an architectural shift. So in the Victorian era, there was often three primary public rooms: the parlor, the sitting room or library, and the dining room. The parlor frequently could be closed off. Now, Rob and I currently live in a duplex that was built in 1909, and we have a parlor for the first time in our married life. But one of the purposes of the parlor and the doors closing is that when you had a family member die, the body was laid out in the parlor, and family and friends were invited to the home to essentially have a wake, to visit with you, to grieve with you, and share stories about the deceased. But the body remained in the home for a day or two and then was taken away. And often there were open casket services where, again, people would encounter the body. And then a cultural shift started to happen in the 50s, where we moved away from that death-obsessed culture post-war. We wanted that behind us, and really moved into what could be said into the death-denying culture. We no longer had contact with bodies that had died, and the architecture marked that change by no longer having compartmentalized rooms, and did not any longer have formal parlors, but had living rooms. And I remember when my grandmother and my grandfather, had a home built for themselves in the 50s, and how thrilled my grandmother was to get away from that Victorian architecture and build a modern home that had the first living room in their neighborhood, and how proud she was of that living room her entire life. But it meant that when my grandfather died, his body was taken away. There was no gathering in the home with the body. There certainly was a gathering of family and friends. But I never came in contact with my beloved grandfather's body because it simply wasn't done in the 60s and 70s, at least in liberal religious circles like my family. When we first arrived at Unity, Rob and I were told by a few of the elders, we do not have bodies at our memorial services. And we said, well, we know that it is not the general custom in Unitarian Universalism or in liberal religion to have a casket with a body. But if a family at Unity wants and needs that for their grieving process, we will allow a casket into the sanctuary of Unity Church. And it is extremely rare, but we have had a couple of viewings with caskets at Unity. But more importantly, what's significant about the tolling of the bells service is that it acknowledges the amount of grief that is always present in a gathered religious community. And it seeks to honor that grief and to honor those that we have lost. Each one of us is the author of our own grief, and this service tries to lift up and convey that message of empowerment that you are the author of your grief. Each one of us grieves differently and uniquely. Grief ebbs and flows, and it has no expiration date, as we often say in our services. When Rob and I leave, our particular way of doing memorial services will go with us. And new ministers, the interim and the settled senior, will bring their own lens to memorial services. And things will feel the same and yet feel different. And what a gift to be able to watch this time of transition. But I would hope that this Tolling the Bells service helps everyone at Unity Church understand the power of the gathered community, how we support one another in our times of grief and sorrow, and how important it is to mark our losses as a community. Thank you so much for being with me today. Take good care. Grieve well.